The telegram was a lifeline, a 4-line whisper of a job promising refuge from the ghosts that haunted her. Cook for a man and his 7 children. It sounded simple, a penance of pots and pans in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Montana Territory. But when Katie stepped off that stagecoach, the dust settling on her worn boots, she found more than a grieving family. She found a house choked with secrets, a cold, withdrawn man, whose eyes held a storm of unspoken pain, and 7 children, not just motherless, but lost. She was hired to feed their bodies, but she would soon discover it was their souls and her own that were truly starving. The Montana air in the autumn of 1888 was a liar. It carried the crisp, clean promise of pine and distant snow, a scent of purity that belied the grit and grime of daily existence. For Katie Hayes, stepping down from the jarring confines of the stagecoach in the fledgling town of Redemption, the air was the first thing she noticed that wasn't choked with the coal dust and sorrow of her past life in Butte. Her lungs, accustomed to the city's foul breath, drank it in greedily, but the relief was fleeting. A widow's black dress, though practical, felt heavy and conspicuous under the vast, piercingly blue sky. Her husband Liam, a man whose laughter had once been as bright and booming as a mine blast, had been silenced by one. He'd left her with little more than a stack of debts and a heart hollowed out by the sudden violent emptiness. The telegram she clutched in her gloved hand was her only compass now. It had been terse, almost brutally so. Widower needs cook and housekeeper. 7 children. M. Sorvance. Redemption Station. 7 children. The number had echoed in her mind for the entire journey, a daunting chorus of need. A man was waiting by a worn buckboard wagon, his form as rigid and unyielding as the mountains that clawed at the horizon. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but there was a stoop to his frame, the permanent cringe of a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a mask of grim forbearance. His hat was pulled low, but she could see eyes the color of a stormy sky, and they held no welcome. Mrs. Hayes. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. It wasn't a question so much as a confirmation of an unpleasant necessity. Mr. Vance, she replied, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. She offered a small, hesitant nod. Thank you for meeting me. He gave a curt nod in return, his gaze sweeping over her small, battered trunk with an air of impatient appraisal. It's a long ride out to the homestead. Get your things. He didn't offer to help. The silence on the journey was a heavy blanket, broken only by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. Katie sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, stealing glances at the man beside her. Jacob Vance. He drove with a grim, single-minded focus, his knuckles white on the reins. He looked like a man at war, with the very land he worked, with the air he breathed with himself. She had known grief had been swallowed by it, but his was different. Hers was a raw, weeping wound. His was a scar thick and hard and ugly. As they left the last vestiges of redemption behind, the landscape opened up into a breathtaking, intimidating panorama of rolling plains and distant, toothy peaks. The beauty was wild, untamed, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. It was a place where a person could disappear, where a cry for help would be swallowed by the wind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, He pointed with his chin towards a cluster of buildings huddled in a shallow valley. The homestead. It was less a home and more a fortification against the wilderness. A sturdy two-story log house stood sentinel over a collection of smaller, rough-hewn structures, a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop. Everything was functional, stark, and devoid of any softening touches. There were no flowers, no painted shutters, no sign of a woman's hand. A wave of unease washed over Katie. What had happened to the woman who had borne this man 7 children? The telegram had only said widower. It had not offered details, and his forbidding presence discouraged questions. As the wagon rolled to a stop, the front door of the house burst open, and the children spilled out. It was not a welcoming committee. They were a chaotic, tumbling wave of humanity, a wild pack of half-tamed creatures. They ranged in age from a towering boy who looked to be in his late teens, down to a small, thumb-sucking girl who couldn't have been more than 4. They were all dressed in drab, patched clothing, their faces smudged with dirt, their hair a collection of unruly mops. They stopped and stared at her, their expressions a mixture of raw curiosity and deep-seated suspicion. Jacob Vance swung himself down from the wagon. "This is Mrs. Hayes," he announced to the assembled tribe, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "She's here to cook. See you don't get in her way." He turned to the oldest boy. "Thomas, take Mrs. Hayes' trunk inside. Show her the kitchen." Thomas, a sullen-faced youth with his father's stormy eyes, glared at Katie as if she were a new and unwelcome species of insect. He was nearly a man grown with the resentful posture of someone forced into responsibility too soon. He hefted her trunk with a grudging strength and stomped towards the house, letting the screen door slam behind him. One by one, the other children seemed to melt away, scattering like quail into the barn, and behind the woodpile, all except the smallest girl. She stood her ground, her wide, serious eyes fixed on Katie. She had a mop of tangled blonde curls and was clutching a faceless corn-husk doll. Katie's heart, which had felt like a cold stone in her chest, gave a painful lurch. She knelt, ignoring the dust that soiled her black dress. "Hello there," she said softly. "What's your name?" The little girl took a hesitant step back, her thumb finding its way to her mouth. "That's Clara," a voice piped up. A girl of about 10 with freckles spattered across her nose and a pair of watchful, intelligent eyes had lingered by the porch steps. "She don't talk much." "Not since Mama." She trailed off, glancing nervously towards her father, who was unhitching the horses. "I'm Sarah." The girl added her tone a mixture of childish frankness and premature world-weariness. "You really gonna cook for us?" "I am," Katie confirmed, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "I hope you're all hungry." Sarah snorted a sound of cynical disbelief that was startling from someone so young. "Joshua's been doing the cooking. Mostly we eat burnt beans and jerky." The inside of the house was even more grim than the outside. The main room was large and sparsely furnished, dominated by a massive stone fireplace, its hearth black with soot. A long, scarred wooden table was surrounded by a motley collection of chairs and stools. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, and the air smelled of stale smoke, unwashed bodies, and despair. The kitchen was a small dark annex off the main room. Thomas had dumped her trunk in the middle of the floor and disappeared. A cast-iron stove stood cold and menacing in one corner. A collection of blackened pots and dented pans hung from hooks on the wall. The pantry was a disaster of spilled flour, weevil-infested cornmeal, and a few sad-looking potatoes. This wasn't just a house without a woman's touch. It was a house without hope. As she stood there, taking in the monumental task before her, the full weight of her decision settled upon her. She had fled one kind of desolation, only to find herself in another. This was to be her penance, then. A purgatory of burnt beans and sullen children. That first evening was a trial by fire. The children whose names she slowly learned, Thomas the resentful heir apparent, Joshua, a quieter boy of 15, who seemed to be his brother's shadow, the watchful Sarah, identical twin boys of 8 named Caleb and Daniel, who moved with a silent, unnerving synchronicity, a mischievous 6-year-old named Benjamin, and the silent, watchful Clara treated her with a wall of collective hostility. They watched her every move, their eyes missing nothing. She found a side of bacon in the smokehouse and set about making a real meal. She scrubbed the pots, coaxed the stove to life, and filled the kitchen with the unfamiliar, tantalizing aromas of frying bacon, bubbling gravy, and hot biscuits. The children gathered at the table, drawn by the smells, but their faces remained guarded. Jacob Vance sat at the head of the table, a silent, brooding monarch, presiding over his chaotic kingdom. He ate without a word, his eyes fixed on his plate. The children followed his lead, shoveling the food into their mouths with a grim efficiency. The silence was deafening. It was not a peaceful silence, but a tense, watchful one, heavy with things unsaid. After the meal, as Katie cleared the plates, Thomas stood up abruptly. "I'm checking the traps," he muttered, and strode out of the house. Joshua followed a moment later. The younger children vanished upstairs to their shared rooms. Katie was left in the kitchen with the mountain of dishes and the lingering silence of the house. As she pumped water into the basin, her gaze fell on a small, crudely carved wooden bird sitting on the windowsill. It was a delicate, beautiful thing, its lines smooth and graceful. It was so completely out of place in this harsh, utilitarian environment. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. It felt warm, as if it had been held recently. "Mama made that." Katie turned, startled. Sarah was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "It's beautiful," Katie said softly. "Your mother was very talented." Sarah's face clouded over. "She wasn't sick," she said, her voice low and fierce. "The fever didn't take her. Not like Pa says." Katie froze the wooden bird, feeling suddenly heavy in her hand. "What do you mean, Sarah?" But the girl's brief moment of openness was gone. She shook her head. Her expression shuttered once more. "Nothing. You're just the cook." She turned and fled up the stairs, leaving Katie alone with the crackling of the fire. The silence of the house and a cold, unsettling premonition that she had stumbled into, a darkness far deeper than simple grief. The wooden bird seemed to whisper of a secret, and the wild, lonely land outside seemed determined to keep it. The first weeks at the Vance homestead were a relentless assault on Katie's senses and her resolve. The house was a living, breathing entity of chaos. Dirt seemed to breed in the corners the children communicated in a language of grunts and shouts, and Jacob Vance remained a figure carved from granite, his silence a constant, oppressive presence. Katie began her campaign, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady acts of reclamation. She started with the kitchen. She scoured the soot from the pots until they gleamed, scrubbed the wooden floors, until the clean scent of lye soap overpowered the lingering smell of neglect and organized the pantry into a bastion of order. She woke before the sun, her hands cracked and raw from the harsh soap and hot water, and filled the cold morning air with the scent of baking bread. At first, the children treated her efforts with cynical disdain. They were used to fending for themselves to a world where meals were a matter of survival, not comfort. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. The warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread was a seductive lure. The twins Caleb and Daniel began to hover in the kitchen doorway in the mornings, their identical faces betraying a flicker of interest. Benjamin, the mischievous one, was caught snatching a warm biscuit from the cooling rack, and the look of pure, unadulterated bliss on his face as he bit into it was a small but significant victory. Her greatest challenge and her most fervent wish was to reach little Clara. The child remained a silent ghost flitting at the edges of the family's chaotic orbit, her thumb permanently lodged in her mouth, her corn-husk doll, her only companion. Katie would leave small offerings for her, a brightly colored pebble, a cookie shaped like a star, a ribbon saved from her own meager possessions. The items would always disappear, but the child herself remained tantalizingly out of reach. The truce when it came was brokered by a needle and thread. Joshua, the quiet second eldest son, tore his shirt on a nail while working in the barn. He came into the kitchen holding the ripped garment, his face a mask of frustration, clearly expecting to be berated. In this household, a torn shirt was a minor catastrophe. "Give it here," Katie said gently, taking the shirt from him. She sat by the fire that evening, the flickering light illuminating her work as she meticulously stitched the torn fabric. She didn't just mend it, she reinforced the seam, her stitches small and even. The next morning, she left the folded shirt on his pillow. She received no thanks, but later that day, as she was kneading dough, Joshua appeared in the kitchen. He stood silently for a long moment, watching her work. "My ma, she used to make bread like that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She'd let me punch it down." Katie's hands stilled. She looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and saw past the sullen exterior to the lonely child beneath. "Well," she said, her voice soft, "this dough could use a good punching." A hesitant smile touched Joshua's lips. He washed his hands and joined her at the table, his tentative fists sinking into the soft, pliable dough. It was the first crack in the wall of ice that had encased the Vance children. Thomas, however, remained her implacable foe. As the oldest, he had been forced to shoulder the burden of his mother's death and the subsequent collapse of his family. He saw Katie not as a helpmate, but as an interloper, a usurper of his mother's place. He treated her with a cold, biting contempt, challenging her at every turn. "We don't need your fancy cooking," he sneered one evening, pushing away a plate of chicken and dumplings she had spent all afternoon preparing. "We did just fine on our own." "Did you?" Katie asked quietly, her gaze steady. "Were you fine, Thomas? Or were you just surviving?" Her question hit its mark. A flicker of something pain, anger, confusion crossed his face before the mask of sullen indifference slammed back into place. He stood up, knocking his chair back, and stormed out of the house. Jacob, who had witnessed the exchange in his usual brooding silence, looked at her, his stormy eyes unreadable. For a moment, Katie thought he would reprimand her for challenging his son. Instead, he gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of a truth he couldn't bring himself to speak. The nights were the hardest. After the children were in bed and the house fell silent, the ghosts came out to play. Katie would lie in her small, cold room, the memory of Liam's laughter echoing in the darkness, the ache of her own loss a palpable weight in her chest. She had come to redemption to escape her grief, But here in this house of sorrows, it seemed to have found fertile ground in which to grow. One night, unable to sleep, she went down to the kitchen for a drink of water. The main room was dark, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. A floorboard creaked upstairs, followed by a soft, whimpering cry. It was Clara. Katie's heart went out to the little girl. She crept up the stairs, her bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The door to the girl's room was ajar. Peeking inside, she saw Clara thrashing in her small bed, caught in the throes of a nightmare. Sarah, in the bed next to her, was fast asleep. Katie slipped into the room and knelt by Clara's bed. She gently stroked the child's tangled hair, humming a soft, wordless lullaby her own mother had sung to her. The whimpering subsided, and Clara's small body began to relax. Katie stayed there for a long time, her hand a comforting presence on the child's back, until her breathing was deep and even. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on a small chest at the foot of Sarah's bed. It was unlocked. A piece of faded calico fabric was sticking out from under the lid. On impulse, driven by a curiosity, she couldn't explain. Katie gently lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst a collection of childish treasures, smooth stones, a bird's nest. A string of beads was a leather-bound journal. It was worn, the cover soft from years of handling. Katie knew with a sudden chilling certainty that it had belonged to Martha Vance. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. This was a violation, a trespass into a sacred space. But Sra's cryptic words from her first night, "She wasn't sick," echoed in her mind. She had to know. She took the journal back to her room, her heart pounding a guilty rhythm against her ribs. By the light of a single candle she opened it. The handwriting was elegant feminine, a stark contrast to the harshness of the world in which it had been written. The first few entries were filled with the mundane joys and tribulations of a wife and mother, on the frontier notes about the garden, the children's latest mischief, her love for her husband. But as she read on, the tone began to change. A shadow fell over the pages. The entries became shorter, more furtive. A name began to appear, a name that sent a chill down Katie's spine, Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood rode over again today. One entry read, "He brings Jacob whiskey and talks of buying the northern pasture. Jacob is tempted. The man's eyes linger on me. They make my skin crawl." Another entry a few weeks later, Jacob was in town. Blackwood came by on the pretense of looking for a stray calf. He did not leave when I asked him to. He said things, vile things. I told him to stay away from my husband, from my home. He only laughed. He said this land would be his, one way or another. The last entry was short, the handwriting shaky, almost illegible. Jacob is angry. He drank the whiskey Blackwood brought. We fought. He doesn't believe me. He called me a hysterical fool. Blackwood is coming back. I see his shadow on the plains. I am so afraid. For my children. For myself. God help us. Katie closed the journal, her blood running cold. This was no fever. Martha Vance had been living in terror, and her husband, blinded by pride and whiskey, had refused to see it. She looked out her window at the moon-drenched landscape. The wild beauty she had once admired now seemed menacing sinister. The wind whistling around the corners of the house sounded like a woman's mournful cry. She had come to this house as a cook, a hired hand. But now, clutching the dead woman's secrets to her chest, she had become something else entirely. She was a witness, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the shadow of Silas Blackwood still lingered over this land and over the family she was beginning to call her own. The Cold War within the Vance home was over. A much more dangerous one was about to begin. The discovery of Martha's journal shifted the ground beneath Katie's feet. The house was no longer just a place of grief. It was a place of secrets, haunted by the ghost of a story that had been deliberately buried. The children's sullenness, Thomas's anger, Clara's silence, Jacob's impenetrable despair. It all took on a new, more sinister meaning. They were not just mourning a mother. They were survivors of a tragedy they didn't have the words to name. Katie returned the journal to the chest before dawn, her heart heavy with the burden of her newfound knowledge. She now looked at Jacob Vance through a different lens. His grief was not just for a dead wife, but for his own monumental failure to protect her. The whiskey she had seen him drink on occasion was not just a solace, but a poison, the same one that had clouded his judgment and left his wife vulnerable. Her interactions with the children changed. She was no longer just a cook trying to win their affection. She was a guardian, a protector. She watched them with a fierce, hawk-like intensity, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon for a rider for the shadow Martha had written about. The name Silas Blackwood was a stone in her shoe, a constant nagging irritant. She knew she had to learn more about him. Her opportunity came during her next trip into redemption with Jacob for supplies, while he was negotiating with the blacksmith. She made her way to the general store, a place that served as the town's nerve center, a hub of gossip and information. Mrs. Peterson, the proprietor, was a plump, bustling woman with a kind face and an insatiable curiosity. As she measured out flour and sugar for Katie, she couldn't hide her interest in the newcomer at the Vance homestead. "It's good that Jacob finally hired some help," she said, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Those poor children have been running wild since Martha passed." She paused, her eyes searching Katie's for a reaction. "It's a big job," Katie said, non-committally, carefully arranging her purchases in her basket. 7 children is a handful. And that Thomas Mrs. Peterson clucked her tongue. "He's got his father's temper, that one. Always spoiling for a fight, especially with any of Silas Blackwood's ranch hands." Katie's heart skipped a beat. She feigned a casual interest. "Silas Blackwood?" she asked, her voice steady. "Does he own the neighboring ranch?" "Owns it and just about everything else, or so he'd like to think." Mrs. Peterson sniffed. "Bought up the old Miller place a few years back, right after he came into some money. Throws that money around like he's a king. A coarse, arrogant man, if you ask me. Always thought he had his eye on the Vance's northern pasture. It's got the best water access in this valley." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He and Jacob used to be friendly, you know. Before Martha died. After that, well, you can feel the bad blood clear across the valley. They say Jacob blames him for something, though no one knows what. Silas, for his part, acts like he owns the place. Struts around town buying drinks for everyone, but there's a coldness to him. I wouldn't turn my back on him, that's for sure." The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a dark and unsettling picture. Katie felt a chill despite the warmth of the store. Back at the homestead, the atmosphere was slowly changing. Katie's quiet persistence was beginning to wear down the children's defenses. Joshua now sought her out in the kitchen, his quiet presence a comfort. The twins, Caleb and Daniel, had started to bring her little treasures, a strangely shaped rock, a feather from a bluebird's wing. Even Benjamin, the little rascal, seemed to be tempering his mischief with a newfound affection, occasionally rewarding her with a gap-toothed angelic smile. Her biggest breakthrough came with Clara. One afternoon, Katie was sitting on the porch mending one of Benjamin's shirts. Clara, who had been hovering near the steps, crept closer, her eyes fixed on the rhythmic movement of the needle. Katie, sensing the delicate truce, didn't look up. She simply began to hum the same lullaby she had sung to the child during her nightmare. She finished her mending and, without a word, began to stitch a small, simple face onto the corn-husk doll that was always clutched in Clara's hand. She used black thread for the eyes and red for a smiling mouth. She held it out. Clara hesitated for a long moment, her wide eyes searching Katie's face. Then slowly she reached out her small hand and took the doll. She looked at its new face, her own expression unreadable. She then turned and walked over to the porch swing, sat down, and began to gently rock her newly ensouled companion. She didn't speak, but it was a beginning. The fragile peace was shattered a few days later. Katie was hanging laundry on the line, the clean, wet sheets snapping in the wind, when she saw a rider approaching. He was a big man on a powerful black horse, and he rode with an air of arrogant ownership, as if the land itself belonged to him. Even from a distance, Katie knew who it was. Silas Blackwood. Her blood ran cold. She quickly herded the younger children who had been playing nearby into the house. "Go to your rooms," she said, her voice sharp with an urgency that startled them into obedience. She stood on the porch, her hands clenched at her sides as Blackwood reined in his horse. He was a handsome man, in a brutish sort of way, with a thick neck, a florid complexion, and eyes that were a cold, pale blue. He swept off his hat, revealing a head of slick, dark hair. His smile was mute and predatory. Well, now he boomed, his gaze sweeping over her in a way that made her feel soiled. Jacob's finally got himself some proper help, and a pretty little thing at that. "I'm Silas Blackwood, your neighbor." "I know who you are," Katie said, her voice like ice. His smile faltered for a second, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. "Feisty. I like that. Is Jacob around?" "He's out on the range," she lied, her heart pounding. She had seen Jacob riding towards the southern pastures that morning. Is he now? Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He swung himself down from his horse with a surprising agility for a man his size. He walked towards the porch, his spurs jingling a menacing tune on the hard-packed earth. "That's a shame. I was hoping to talk to him about that northern pasture of his. A man with so many mouths to feed could use the cash I'm offering." He was close now, standing at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. The smell of whiskey and sweat wafted from him. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I think you should leave, Katie," said her voice, trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to keep it steady. He laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Or what? You'll shoo me away with your apron." He took a step up onto the porch. "Get away from her." The voice was low and filled with a cold, deadly fury. Thomas was standing in the doorway of the barn, a hunting rifle held loosely in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying to behold. Blackwood froze his body, tensing. He turned slowly to face the boy. "Put the gun down, son," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You don't want to do something you'll regret. I'm not your son." Thomas spat his knuckles white on the rifle stock. "And the only thing I regret is not being here the last time you came sniffing around." The air crackled with tension. Katie's breath caught in her throat. She could see the scene playing out in her mind, the flash of gunfire, the splash of blood, another tragedy to stain this already cursed land. "Thomas, no," she whispered, taking a step towards him. "Stay out of this," he snarled, his eyes never leaving Blackwood. For a long moment, no one moved. It was a standoff, a battle of wills between a boy consumed by rage and a man fueled by greed. Then Blackwood slowly raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Easy now," he said, his predatory smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No need for all this unpleasantness. I was just being neighborly." He backed away slowly, his eyes still locked on Thomas. He swung himself back onto his horse, his movements fluid and controlled. He looked down at Katie, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. "You tell Jacob I'll be back to talk business," he said. He then turned his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. As soon as he was gone, Thomas's bravado seemed to crumble. The rifle sagged in his hands, and he leaned against the barn door, his breathing ragged. Katie rushed over to him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her hand hovering over his arm, unsure if she should touch him. He wouldn't look at her. He just stared at the spot where Blackwood had disappeared, his young face a mask of anguish. "He killed her," he whispered, his voice choked with a pain so raw it tore at Katie's heart. "That man, he killed my mother." The confession whispered into the wind confirmed Katie's darkest fears. The shadows that had been lurking at the edges of the Vance family had finally coalesced into a tangible, menacing form. And she, the hired cook, was now standing right in the middle of them. Thomas's whispered accusation hung in the air long after Silas Blackwood had disappeared over the horizon. It was the key, the final terrible piece of the puzzle that Katie had been assembling in the darkness. The journal, the whispers, the children's fear, it all clicked into place, forming a picture of such profound betrayal and violence that it stole her breath. She looked at Thomas, who was still slumped against the barn, the rifle now hanging limply from his hand. The anger that had sustained him during the confrontation had drained away, leaving behind a boyish vulnerability that was heartbreaking to see. This wasn't just the anger of a rebellious teenager. It was the deep, festering wound of a child who had witnessed something horrific and had been forced to carry the secret alone. "Thomas," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You need to tell me everything." He finally looked at her. His stormy eyes filled with a tortured mixture of grief and fury. For a moment she thought he would retreat back into his shell of sullen silence. But then, something in her own steady gaze, in the quiet strength she projected, seemed to reach him. The dam of his long-held silence finally broke. They sat in the dim, hay-scented interior of the barn, the place where he and his siblings had once played under their mother's watchful eye. In a low, halting voice, Thomas recounted the events of the day his mother died. It hadn't been a swift, merciful fever. It had been a slow, agonizing descent into terror. Blackwood had been a constant, unwelcome presence in the months leading up to her death, he explained. He was always there at the edge of the property, his eyes following Martha, his offers to buy the northern pasture, becoming more and more insistent. Jacob, his pride stung by a bad year for his crops, and his judgment clouded by Blackwood's gifts of whiskey, had dismissed his wife's fears as female hysteria. "Pa!" He wouldn't listen. Thomas said, his voice thick with a sorrow that was years old. He and Ma, they fought. I'd hear them at night. He called her crazy. On that final day, Jacob had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Thomas, then only 14, in charge. Blackwood had come to the house. He was drunk, his usual predatory charm replaced by a raw, menacing aggression. He'd cornered Martha in the kitchen, his voice low and threatening. Thomas, hidden in the pantry, had heard everything. Blackwood hadn't wanted just the land. He'd wanted Martha too. He'd made her a vile offer, a threat disguised as a proposition. When she'd spat in his face, he'd grabbed her. She fought him. Thomas whispered, his eyes squeezed shut as if to block out the memory. She hit him with a skillet. He pushed her. Hard. She fell and hit her head on the hearth, the big stone fireplace. He fell silent, his body racked with tremors. Katie reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her own heart aching for the terrified boy he had been. She wasn't dead. He continued, his voice barely audible. Not right away. He just stood there, looking at her. Then he laughed. He told me that if I ever told anyone what I saw, he'd come back for the rest of us. He said he'd burn this place to the ground with all of us in it. Blackwood had then concocted the story of a sudden virulent fever. He'd ridden for the doctor himself, playing the part of the concerned neighbor. By the time Jacob returned, Martha was gone. The doctor had signed the death certificate, and Thomas was trapped in a prison of fear and silence. I tried to tell Pa. He said a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. But he was so crazy with grief and guilt. He wouldn't hear it. He hit me, told me never to speak of it again. It was easier for him to believe the fever story than to believe he'd let a monster into our house and let him kill his wife. The confession left Katie breathless. The weight of this secret had been crushing the boy, poisoning his relationship with his father, and casting a long, dark shadow over the entire family. Now she understood. The whiskey, the silence, the impenetrable wall around Jacob's heart. It was all a monument to his guilt. When Jacob returned that evening, Katie was waiting for him. She sent the children upstairs after a tense, quiet dinner, a silent command in her eyes that for the first time they all obeyed without question, even Thomas. She stood before the hearth, the very place where Martha had fallen, and faced the man she had come to both pity and resent. "We need to talk, Jacob," she said, her voice devoid of its usual softness. It was the voice of a woman who would not be silenced. He looked up from the fire, he was poking a weary, defensive look in his eyes. "I'm tired, Mrs. Hayes. I don't care," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Because Martha is tired. She's tired of waiting for justice. And your son is tired of carrying a burden that should have been yours." The color drained from Jacob's face. He straightened up, the poker clattering to the stone hearth. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" She challenged, her eyes blazing. "Don't you lie to me." "Not anymore. Thomas told me everything. About Blackwood, about the fall, about the lie you've been living with for 3 years. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. It was as if she had peeled back the thick scar tissue of his grief and exposed the raw, gaping wound beneath. "He's a boy," Jacob whispered, his voice hoarse. He was confused, scared. He was telling the truth, and you know it. Katie's voice rose, filled with the righteous fury of 2 women herself and the ghost of Martha. You were so drowning in your own guilt and pride that you refused to listen. You let that man murder your wife, and then you silenced the only witness. You let your son believe that his own father didn't believe him. What kind of man does that? Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the carefully constructed walls of his denial. He staggered back, his hand coming up as if to ward off her words. I loved her. He choked out the words torn from his soul. I know you did, Katie said, her voice softening slightly, the anger replaced by a deep, profound sadness. And that's the tragedy of it, isn't it? You loved her, and you let her down. You let that snake into your home. You drank his poison, and you ignored her pleas for help. And you have been punishing yourself and your children ever since. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the dry, silent sobs of a man who had not allowed himself to truly weep in years. The granite statue had finally crumbled, revealing the broken, grieving man inside. Katie let him cry. She stood in the firelight, her own heart aching with the weight of it all. This was the reckoning, the painful, necessary exorcism of the lies that had poisoned this family. When his sobs finally subsided, he looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a despair so profound it was almost bottomless. "What do I do?" he whispered. He told Thomas he would kill them all. He'll do it. The man has no soul. A man with no soul still fears the gallows. Katie said, her voice hard as steel. He has power because everyone is afraid of him. But he's just a man, Jacob, a bully and a murderer, and we are not going to let him win. She looked around the room, at the home she had come to care for, at the empty chairs where a vibrant family should have been laughing and talking. She thought of the 7 children upstairs, sleeping fitfully in their beds, their childhood stolen by a shadow. "You are not alone in this fight anymore," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Martha is gone. But I am here now, and I will not let him harm one hair on those children's heads. He wanted your land, your wife, your future. It's time we took it back." In the flickering firelight, Jacob Vance looked at the woman standing before him, the widow who had come to cook his meals and had instead unearthed his soul. For the first time since Martha's death, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in the desolate landscape of his heart. The reckoning was over. The battle was about to begin. The confession changed everything. The oppressive silence that had suffocated the Vance homestead for 3 years was replaced by a fragile, terrifying honesty. The truth, as ugly as it was out. Jacob, stripped of his defenses, was a man laid bare. He began to talk first to Katie in the quiet of the night, and then haltingly to Thomas. The conversation between father and son was one of the most painful things Katie had ever witnessed. It took place in the barn, the scene of so much of their shared trauma. There were no easy apologies, no swift absolution. There were just years of unspoken pain, anger and misunderstanding laid out between them. Jacob, his voice thick with shame, finally acknowledged his son's truth, and in doing so, acknowledged his own profound failure. "I was a coward," Jacob admitted, his gaze fixed on the dusty floor. It was easier to believe the lie, Thomas. Easier than admitting I let that man, that I didn't protect your mother. Thomas, his face a stoic mask that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his jaw, just nodded. "I know, Pa." It was a quiet acknowledgement, but it was enough. It was the beginning of a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. With the truth exposed within the family, the question became what to do about Silas Blackwood. He was a powerful man with ranch hands who were more like thugs, and a reputation that made most townsfolk wary of crossing him. The law in redemption was embodied by Sheriff Miller, a well-meaning but timid man who was easily intimidated by Blackwood's wealth and influence. A boy's 3-year-old testimony against a respected landowner wouldn't be enough. They needed proof. "His greed is his weakness," Katie said one evening as Jacob and Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm circle of light in the otherwise dark room. It had become their war room. He didn't just want Martha. He wanted the northern pasture. Mrs. Peterson at the store said he's still trying to buy it. He needs the water access. "He's been bleeding me dry," Jacob admitted, a bitter twist to his lips. "Mysterious fence cuttings, cattle getting sick. I've had to borrow money twice this year just to stay afloat. Money from the bank. Blackwood has a stake in. He's trying to force you to sell Katie," realized. "He's not just waiting for you to give in. He's actively trying to ruin you." An idea began to form in her mind, a risky, dangerous plan that relied on cunning rather than brute force. "We're going to give him what he wants," she said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce intelligence. "Or at least we're going to make him think he's going to get it." The plan was simple in its design, but fraught with peril. Jacob would let it be known around town that he was finally broken, that he was ready to sell the northern pasture to Blackwood. He would arrange a meeting at the homestead to sign the papers insisting that the payment be made in cash. The meeting would be their trap. The next few days were a blur of tense preparation. Jacob made the trip to redemption playing the part of a defeated man. His performance so convincing it broke Katie's heart. He spoke to Sheriff Miller not of murder, but of his fear of being cheated by Blackwood. He asked the sheriff to be present at the signing, to act as an official witness to the transaction. The timid sheriff, seeing it as a simple civil matter, agreed. Back at the homestead, the atmosphere was electric. The older children, Thomas and Joshua, were brought into the plan. The change in them was remarkable. With the secret out in the open, they were no longer just sullen boys. They were young men, with a purpose, their eyes bright with a determination to protect their family. The day of the meeting arrived grey and overcast, the sky threatening a storm. Katie felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but her face was a mask of calm resolve. She sent the younger children to a neighbor's farm down the valley, a trusted family who knew nothing of the plan, other than that the Vances were having business troubles. Blackwood arrived shortly after noon, flanked by 2 of his brutish ranch hands. He was triumphant, his face flushed with victory. He strode into the main room of the house as if he already owned it, his predatory gaze sweeping over the worn furniture. "Vance," he boomed, clapping a patronizing hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Glad you finally saw reason. A wise decision." Jacob, his face a mask of weary resignation, just nodded towards the table where the bill of sale was laid out. The money. Blackwood. Sheriff Miller stood nervously by the fireplace, looking deeply uncomfortable. Blackwood laughed and produced a thick leather satchel, which he upended onto the table. Bundles of cash spilled out. "Count it if you like," he said with a smirk. As Jacob reached for the papers, Katie stepped forward from the kitchen, a tray with a pitcher of water and glasses in her hands. "I'm sure Mr. Blackwood is thirsty after his ride," she said, her voice steady. She placed the tray on the table, her eyes meeting Blackwood's. "It's a terrible thing," she said. her voice filled with a sad conversational tone how quickly a fever can take someone. Martha, for instance. 1 minute she was fine, the next. Gone. Blackwood's smirk faltered. A flicker of unease crossed his face. A tragedy, he said, his voice a little too loud. Yes, Katie continued, her gaze unwavering. A terrible fall, a blow to the head. It can happen so quickly. One slip on a stone hearth, and a life is over. The color drained from Blackwood's face. He stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. What kind of nonsense are you talking, woman? She's talking about murder, Jacob said, his voice a low growl. He was no longer playing the part of a defeated man. He was a husband, avenging his wife, a father, protecting his children. From the kitchen doorway, Thomas stepped out, his rifle held steady. From the stairs, Joshua appeared holding his own shotgun. The two ranch hands who had been lounging by the door froze their hands, hovering over their pistols. "What is the meaning of this, Sheriff?" Miller squeaked his hand, fumbling for his own weapon. "The meaning, Sheriff," Katie said, her voice ringing through the tense room, "is that Silas Blackwood didn't buy this land. He tried to steal it, the same way he tried to steal Jacob's wife, and when she refused him, he killed her." "This is insane," Blackwood roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "It's her word against mine. A hysterical woman and a lying boy." "It's more than their word," a new voice said. From the shadows of the hallway, a man stepped forward. It was Jedediah, one of Blackwood's own ranch hands, a quiet older man, who had always looked at his boss with a mixture of fear and contempt. In his hand, he held a ledger. "I keep the books for Mr. Blackwood, Sheriff," Jedediah said, his voice shaking but clear. "He likes to brag. After a few whiskeys, he told me what happened, how he pushed her, how he scared the boy into silence. It's all right here. I wrote it down. The dates, the times, everything." Blackwood stared at Jedediah, his face a mask of pure murderous rage. He lunged not for a gun, but for the ledger, the proof of his damnation. But Jacob was faster. He met Blackwood's charge with a force born of 3 years of repressed grief and fury. The two men crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and grunts and curses. It was a raw, brutal fight, not of skill but of pure, primal rage. In the end, it was Jacob who rose, his breathing ragged, his knuckles bloody. Blackwood lay on the floor, groaning, his fight gone. Sheriff Miller, spurred into action by the undeniable proof of the ledger and the confession of a witness, finally found his courage. He arrested a sputtering, defeated Silas Blackwood and his 2 stunned ranch hands. As the sheriff led them away, the sky, which had been threatening all day, finally broke. The rain came down in sheets, washing the dust from the air, cleansing the land. In the quiet aftermath, the family stood together in the doorway watching the rain. The house, which had once been a prison of secrets and sorrow, felt different. It felt like a home. Katie looked at the faces around her. Jacob, his shoulders finally unburdened. Thomas and Joshua standing tall and proud. Sarah, who had slipped her hand into Katie's, and little Clara, who was looking up at her, a small, shy smile on her face. The corn-husk doll with its stitched-on face was tucked under her arm. Mama Clara whispered, her voice soft but clear as a bell. The single word, the first she had spoken in 3 years, hung in the air, a perfect, beautiful note. It wasn't directed at the ghost of the past, but at the woman who stood before her, the woman who had walked into their broken lives and had with quiet courage and fierce love made them whole again. Katie's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. She squeezed Sarah's hand and smiled down at Clara, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She had come to the Vance homestead as a cook, a widow seeking refuge. But in the heart of their darkness, she had found her own light. She had found a family forged in the fire of tragedy, a family that was against all odds her own. The wild, lonely land no longer seemed intimidating. It felt like home. The story of the Vance family is a testament to the enduring power of hope and the fierce, unyielding strength of a mother's love, even when it comes from the most unexpected of places. Katie Hayes didn't just cook their meals, she healed their hearts and brought a murderer to justice. If their journey from darkness into light moved you, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up and sharing it with someone who loves a story of true grit and redemption. These tales from the frontier are full of forgotten heroes. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you don't miss another story of the extraordinary people who shaped the American West. Thank you for listening.